believes that God's got everybody here in his hands. Way back in the dark days of the 1960s, there were several little humorous comic books, picture books, paperback books entitled Who's in Charge Here that made the rounds. Were popular as they were published. And what it was a book that showed pictures of presidents and kings and world leaders and other notables. I don't want to say necessarily that athletes or movie stars were that big a deal to us, but nonetheless they were people who would be easily recognized. Didn't have to explain who they were, and what it was pictures of these folks, randomly taken many times. And as you see in the comics, if you read the comics, you see these little captions over the people's heads. It says what they are saying. And in this book, you would see pictures of people, and the captions would have nothing to do with what the picture originally was. The one that comes to my mind is a picture of former President Harry Truman sitting in a chair in the Oval Office of the White House beside then President John Kennedy. And they're both mugging the camera and grinning real big. And the caption has Truman saying to Kennedy, "Did they ever fix the toilets around here?" Well, that doesn't have a thing to do. That wasn't what happened. It doesn't have a thing. It was supposed to be an attempt at humor. But the idea was that it was to make you and me think, who's in charge here? I think, my friends, as Doug said in his prayer, that's a good question for you and me to ask today. As we look at life and all that's going on, as we look at so much confusion in life, as we look at the fears that are abounding here and there in life, as we look at the chaos and the hatred and the animosity and the dissension and the pure vitriol of poisoned speech and actions, as we look at what's happening in the White House, from the White House, from the State House, from the courthouse, as we look at what Congress is doing, as we look at what state legislatures are doing, and county commissions, and even town boards and city councils, as we look at both sides of the aisle, at the different parties, the different feelings, as we look at all of that animosity and lack of peace, it is an age-old question that deserves an answer. Who's really in charge here? Now, the Bible tells us that God answered that question very early. It's in not a document, but in a presentation you and I know as the Ten Commandments. And if you've ever read them or paid attention to them or looked them up, you will see that the commandments 1, 2, and 3 center around God. They speak of God, they speak of his nature, of his character, his characteristics of who he is, and how you and I are supposed to live in regard to that. 1, 2, and 3 are about God. The rest of them are about how you and I should act. The first commandment says, as God saying, "You'll have no other gods before me." Now, before in that point doesn't mean like standing in line. Someone comes before you do. It means in place of or instead of. You'll have no other God but me. Verse 2 commandment number 2 is very closely related to that. Well, that commandment says, you are also not to make any idols or to worship them. The original text, original language says, you'll make no idols of wood or metals or graven images. You and I don't necessarily have idols made out of wood, but we can have other things that are our idols, that are our God. It can be our work, it can be our play, it can be any number of things. It can be our feelings or our attitudes, it can be whatever that we give our greatest allegiance to. The thing that controls our life, or those things that control our lives far more than faith in God and God himself. And then the third commandment says, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. That's an interesting commandment. Most of us think that has to do with not using profanity, those words that bring chills to our ears many times, where some people think God's last name is damn. Well, while that's true, it also means don't misuse the name lightly, in vain. Because in the day and age in which the Ten Commandments were created and originated, your name was your very essence. It was who you are. It was sacred in and of itself. And so part of what God is saying here is, don't misuse my name for your sake, for something that suits you that's outside of my will for you. So God has said very clearly who's in charge here. I made the world. It's mine. I created all that's in it. Go back and look at Genesis, and go back and look at the first part of John, and it says that God made everything. Without him was not anything made that was made. And so God is saying, here's what it's all about. The other commandments, as I said, stem from those. And the promise of God is this, that if we will obey those commands, then he will be our God and we can be his people. If and then, when you see those in the Bible, that's a clear indication that herein is a covenant, an agreement. God saying, if you will let me be your God, then I will be your God, and then I will take care of you. You and I, as I've said so many times before, engage in all kinds of covenants and commitments. If you want a new truck or a new vehicle or whatever, you go to the bank and say, if you'll give me enough money to buy this double clutch and E-flat semi-truck, then I will pay you back. Well, we need to live up to those covenants, but the reality of life as we look around is that you and I, many times as individuals and as a nation, especially lately, don't seem to be doing a really good job of living up to that. Here's the good news, friends. God is still in charge, whether we know it or not, or whether we believe it or not. An Old Testament prophet named Habakkuk, I doubt many of us have read much from him. He's on toward the end of the Old Testament. He was one of the folks who prophesied late in the life of the nation before it was carried off into captivity by Babylon. And in chapter 1, in verse 5, God is giving an answer to a question, and it says this: look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed, for I, that is God, I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told. And this book goes on, and in chapter 2, you can see some of these verses. In verse 6, woe to him who piles up stolen goods and makes himself wealthy by extortion. Verse 9, woe to him who builds his realm by unjust gain to set his nest on high. In verse 14, verse 12, woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and establishes a town by crime. Verse 15, woe to him who gives drink to his neighbors, pouring it from the wineskin until they're drunk so they can gaze on their naked bodies. You can fill in the blanks on all of, I don't know what woe means, it doesn't sound good. But you can fill in all of those blanks, all those places, all those things that God says, and find parallels in our society today and how we act as individuals, how sometimes we are very good, but many times we are, like the Bible says, our hearts are utterly wicked. And we can see those things that are going on. When you get to verse 14, here's where God says, who's in charge. He says, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge and glory of the Lord as waters that cover the sea. So God's still in control. I don't know if you believe in coincidence or not. I don't know that it exists. I think it's a funny word we use to describe those things that God has already planned. But in 1999, as the 20th century was drawing to a close, historians took a look at the previous 100 years, and they singled out and they recognized some of the great leaders of that century and for who they were and what they had done. And two of them were President Franklin Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill of England. Both of those men were instrumental in leading their countries to defeat the Nazis and the Japanese in World War II. Both of those men were key figures in what was known as the Allied troops, who were at war with the Axis of evil. But did you know that both of those men nearly lost their lives well before World War II? I didn't until I was reading something the other day. In December of 1931, Winston Churchill, on a visit to America, was hit by a car in New York City as he attempted to cross Fifth Avenue. 2 years later, in December of 1933, in Miami, President Roosevelt was shot at by a would-be assassin who missed him but killed the man standing beside him. Both these men survived. Both these people survived experiences that very easily could have killed them. And the question is, why? Do you suppose it might be because God wanted them alive to do what they did? You see, God causes nations to rise. God causes nations to fall. Habakkuk complained. He knew that Babylon, you go back to chapter 1, verse 5, and read the next few words. He knew that Babylon was going to be raised up to defeat the nation, to take them into captivity. And Habakkuk thought, that's not fair. And you can go on and read those verses. I read them that say, woe to these things that you do that are unjust and against God's will and plan. And you can see that one day in verse 14, that God is going to bring about justice, perfect justice. You see in the bulletin a reference to the book of Job. I want to read a couple of those places. In Job chapter 12, beginning with verse 7, Job he's in great distress. Terrible things have happened to him. You know that story, I hope. And his friends, his so-called friends, come to console him. And there's some lessons in this for you and me. Many times we think when we go to friends and folks who are in tragedy or dealing with things, we've got to talk a lot. We've got to say a lot of things. Sometimes the best response, the best ministry is the ministry of presence and silence. Because some of Job's friends began to tell him, well, Job, you brought this on yourself. You're such a terrible fellow. One of them said, Job, you'll get over this when pigs fly. I mean, with friends like that, who needs enemies? And so Job has finished listening to these folks, and he replies to them, beginning with chapter 12. But down about verse 7, he says, after he's spoken against his buddies, he says, ask the animals, and they will teach you, or the birds of the air, and they will tell you. And speak to the earth, and it will teach you, or let the fish of the sea inform you. Which of all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? In his hand is the life of every creature and the breath of all mankind. And then skip on over to verse 21 and you will see this. He, that is God, pours contempt on nobles and disarms the mighty. He reveals the deep things of darkness and brings deep shadows into the light. He makes nations great and destroys them. He enlarges nations and disperses them. He deprives the leaders of the earth of their reason. He sends them wandering through a trackless waste. They grope in darkness with no light. He makes them stagger like drunkards. I don't know where you fall in the great grand scheme of things, socially, politically, and whatever. But as we look around, we can see some of the things that leaders from local to national, international are doing, and we think, have you lost all reason? Job is doing two things here in the book of Job. Number one, he's dealing with his friends, but secondly, he has discovered a great truth in verse 23, that God and God alone is ultimately behind the rise and the fall of nations and leaders. And my folks, my friends, that should be a comforting thought as far as the politics of the world, as far as the policies of the world, our state, our nation, as far as the trends, especially when we put so much, sometimes too much faith in human leaders and social movements. Job, in the midst of great calamity and distress, saw that God alone sustains countries, cities, and communities, or God alone allows them to fall. Whether in good times or in uncertain times, God is gathering history to himself. And why should we be surprised at that? God has created time. We were looking at in Sunday school about God calling Jeremiah and saying that before you not only were born, but before you were formed in your mother's womb, I knew you and what you were supposed to be about. And if you and I try sometimes to wrap our finite human brains around the mystery and the might and the majesty of God who has no beginning or no end, what does it all mean? Where did God come from? It's a mind-blowing, staggering concept and thought and idea to try to get hold of. God is timeless, and we should find our comfort not in who's governor, or president, or mayor, not in who's majority leader or minority leader, or committee chairman, or chairwoman, or chairperson, or chair, whatever you call them. We should find our comfort knowing, as Habakkuk said, and as Job said, it's God and God alone who is in charge here. God makes nations and leaders great, or he brings them down. My friends, it is God alone who is worthy of our trust and devotion. Is God worthy of your trust and devotion? Now, I watch the news. I can't help that. That's the human part of me, and partly because that was my secular career, news and information and data. I can't let go of some of it. I know, as I've said, it drives other people crazy. I want all the details. They're just details. The great, grand, big picture, the schematic of things is that God is in control. Let that encourage you as you look around and maybe sometimes find distress, difficulty, shock, sorrow, sadness. Let God be the one who is worthy of your devotion. God, the one to whom you look for answers. And when you find yourself asking, what in the world is going on? Who's in charge here? Know that, as the hymn says, this is my Father's world. And God is in charge. Is God in charge of your life as we stand and as we sing? If you cannot answer that question, who's in charge here, by answering, I know in my heart that it's God, I invite you to come and to do that as we stand and as we sing. It's page 43.